In this presentation, we'll be talking about action and how it is mediated in the human body through reflexes.
We will first begin by talking about the anatomy of action and describing the parts of the brain and their functions. The cerebellum is a structure that is located at the caudal end of the brain. It receives input from several regions and is involved in regulating motor movement.
The cerebellum is important for coordination of voluntary movements, motor learning, reflex memory, posture, and sequence learning.
The next structure is the basal ganglia. It is a midbrain structure that is strongly connected with cortical areas, hindbrain structures, and other midbrain structures.
It is involved in the regulation of movements, balance, eye movement, habit formation, reward system, and emotions.
The next structure is the primary motor cortex, or M1, and it is one of the major areas involved in motor function. It is situated in the precentral gyrus of the frontal lobe, anterior to the central sulcus.
M1 is responsible for coordination and initiation of motor movement.
The next structure is the premotor cortex, and it is located in the frontal lobe anterior to the PMC in the lateral regions of the cortex.
It is involved in preparing and executing movements and uses information from other cortical regions to select movements.
The next structure is the parietal lobe. It is a region of the cerebrum that is posterior to the frontal lobe. It contains several sub-areas that have important roles in aiding movement, including the posterior and inferior parietal cortices.
It is also responsible for perception and integration of somatosensory information, transforming multisensory information into motor commands and motor planning.
The final structure or part of the nervous system is the peripheral nervous system, and it plays a major role in executing reflexes without the aid of the brain. This circuit includes the sensory receptors, the afferents that carry information to the spinal cord, and the motor neurons that innervate the skeletal muscles. We will go into further detail when we discuss specific reflexes.
Here we'll be talking about involuntary reflexes. Involuntary reflexes are actions that we do not have direct control over. These reflexes are advantageous in situations where quick action is needed and the body can control action without direct communication to the brain. Reflexes allow for stability to be maintained without any conscious thought and also serve as protective functions. It is important to note the reasons we're able to have these reflexes are due to our muscles that are activated by motor neurons. Motor neurons such as alpha motor neurons specifically excite muscle fibers and produce contractions. An example that I'll be talking about is the stretch reflex. The stretch reflex is important because it allows for postural stability to be maintained by following an unforeseen stretch or disruption. An example of the stretch reflex can be seen when you go to the doctor and get your physical done. What a doctor will do is tap your knee with a hammer. Overall, the doctor is waiting to see if your leg will extend out after tapping the patellar tendon under the knee. When this happens, the following communication mechanisms, also known as the reflex arc, will occur. First, a sensory signal is transmitted through the dorsal root of the spinal cord via an interneuron. This interneuron activates an alpha motor neuron and excites the muscle spindles in the quadriceps to activate and fire. Then the sensory receptors found in the muscles are informed with how much the muscle should be stretched. Then they contract and the knee becomes extended. If this reflex becomes abnormal, it may suggest a communication problem within the central nervous system. In this following video that I will show, it will show a man who had a stroke and created damage to the left hemisphere. It will show his hyperflexia present on his right knee versus his normal left knee.
Tapping on the tendon often. You see, the same reflex requires very little stimulus. And here, again, with the normal side, patella tendon, again extending from below the patella. Strike on the tendon.
I'm going to be talking about the withdrawal or flex reflex. So this reflex is elicited in response to an unexpected painful stimulus where the body retracts itself from something painful without communicating with the brain. While the pain sensation will still arrive at the somatosensory cortex, the withdrawal reflex is localized to the periphery, which allows for a much faster automatic response. For example, the figure here is the mechanism for the withdrawal reflex after stepping on a thumbtack. It begins with the nociceptive stimulus being transduced by free nerve endings in the foot. The signal is carried by A-delta axons traveling from the foot up to the dorsal root ganglia. At the level of the spinal cord, the afferent sensory neuron makes an excitatory synapse onto an interneuron in the dorsal gray matter. This interneuron makes 4 connections with the net result of moving the leg away from the painful stimulus and sending a postural adjustment to the opposite leg. The first 2 synapses occur ipsilaterally in the ventral horn, with one synapse exciting the efferent motor neuron to the flexor muscles, while the other synapse is on a second interneuron that inhibits the extensor muscles. The result of these first 2 connections is to contract the flexors while relaxing the extensors, thereby pulling the leg away from the painful stimulus. With one leg drawn back, there needs to be a postural adjustment made to maintain balance, and this is accomplished by the contralateral signals to the ventral horn. The contralateral signals are the exact opposite of the ipsilateral because the other leg needs to extend while the first contracts. So the excitatory signals are sent to the extensor muscles and an inhibitory interneuron, which inhibits the flexor muscles. The result is the extension of this leg, providing postural support needed from the withdrawal of the opposite leg.
Now we will be discussing some disorders that affect reflexes. The first one is spinal muscular atrophy, SMA, which is a neuromuscular disease that is marked by the wearing of the axons of skeletal muscles that are responsible for voluntary movement. As you can see in the diagram, the SMA axons are much shorter. Motor neurons that are lost have more harsh effects on the proximal area of the body, which is the center of the body. Most types of SMA show symptoms at birth. These children are unable to sit upright and cannot control their head movements. Type 0 is the rarest type. It is evident before a child is even born, and the infant doesn't move as much in the womb and has extremely weak muscles, most notably a weak respiratory tract. Type 1 cases involve the child being unable to control their head movements, which eventually leads to problems with swallowing and breathing. Type 2 manifests between 6 and 12 months of age, and this type symptoms include being unable to walk without assistance, with tremors and other respiratory problems. Type 3 has symptoms that manifest after childhood and after a while require assistance from wheelchairs later in life. Type 4 is also similar, with mild muscle weakness that begins in early adulthood. Based on a study done by Mentis and his colleagues in 2011, mice suffering from SMA have severely compromised motor neurons that correspond to hind limb muscles. They recorded responses in these synapses in the lumbar segment of the spine, which produces a monosynaptic reflex. This reflex was significantly reduced in SMA mice. This reflex is what fails early on in the disease, and it continues to fail as the disease progresses. This inhibited reflex leads to an inability to function normally.
Now I'll talk about Parkinson's disease, which is a nervous system disorder that affects movement. The neurotransmitter dopamine stops being produced after damage to the cells of the substantia nigra. This can be caused by a combination of both genetic factors, the disease running in families, or environmental factors such as toxins, trauma, and inflammation. The main symptoms of Parkinson's disease are tremors, cogwheel rigidity, stiff movements, akinesia, bradykinesia, lack of or slow movements, and disturbances of posture. The typical behavioral effects of the disease, however, are usually not seen until 60% of the nerve cells and 80% of dopamine are already lost. A study by Vreeling and colleagues has shown that patients with Parkinson's disease display more primitive reflexes than those without, and that these primitive reflexes show up and persist. The most prominent of these reflexes in Parkinson's patients are the glabellar tap, nasopalpebral reflex, and the snout reflex. Testing these reflexes can be a helpful way to diagnose patients with Parkinson's disease.